Sipurei masios, the 11th story, the exchanged children. Once, there was a king who had a slave woman to serve the queen in the palace. Obviously, a simple cook would not have access to the king, but this slave woman was a servant of low status. The time came when the queen gave birth. This slave woman also gave birth at the same time. The midwife exchanged the babies to see what would happen and how the situation would develop. She exchanged the infants by placing the king's son next to the slave and the slave's son next to the queen. The two boys grew. The one who was assumed to be the king's son was given greater and greater status until he continued to advance, becoming highly talented. The one who was assumed to be the slave's son, but was the king's true son, grew up in the slave's house. The two of them studied together in the same school. The king's true son was called the slave's son. Nevertheless, by nature, he was drawn to the ways of royalty, even though he was raised in the slave's house. Conversely, the slave's son was known as the king's son. He was drawn by his nature to different ways, not the ways of royalty. However, since he was growing up in the king's palace, he was raised in the royal manner and learned to behave accordingly. Having a weak character, the midwife told someone the secret of how the boys were exchanged. One friend has another, and in usual manner, in the usual manner, the secret was passed from one person to another until everyone was speaking about how the king's son had been exchanged. Of course, people did not speak about it openly, since they did not want the king to hear about it. They did not want the king to know about it, since the king could not do anything. There was no remedy. He could not believe the rumor, since it might have been false, and he could not exchange the boys again. Therefore, the report could not be revealed to the king. Still, the people spoke about it among themselves. Then one day, someone revealed the secret to the king's son, telling him that people were saying that he had been exchanged. However, he said, "It is impossible for you to investigate this, since it would be beneath your dignity. Besides, there is no way to ascertain the truth. However, I feel that it is my duty to inform you of this, since there may be a rebellion against the king someday, and the rebels' hand could be strengthened if they could claim that they are making the king's true son the king. I am speaking of the one whom they claim is the king's son in their rumors. Therefore, you must devise some sort of plan to do away with him." The king's son began to persecute the father of the slave's son, not realize that he was really his own father. He was always looking for ways to do him harm. He caused him one evil after the other, trying to get him to emigrate together with his son. As long as the king was alive, he did not have much power. Still, he caused him evil. But then the king grew old and died, and the slave's son inherited the kingdom. He then did much greater evil to the father of the other son, causing him one evil after another. He would do it in secret ways so that people would not trace the evil back to him, since it would not be proper for the masses to realize what he was doing. Nevertheless, in his secret ways he was able to cause the father much evil. The father of the other son understood that the new king was doing him evil because of the rumors. He told his son, who was actually the king's true son, the entire story. He told him, "No matter what the truth is, I have great pity on you. If you are my son, I certainly have great pity on you. If you are really the king's son, the pity is even greater. He wants to destroy you completely, heaven forbid. Therefore, you must get yourself far away from here." The son thought this was terrible, but he did not have any choice, since the king continued directing persecutions. Literally would constantly fire his evil arrows, one after another. The son therefore made up his mind to leave. His father gave him very much money, and he went on his way. The king's true son was extremely upset about having been exiled from his land for no reason. He thought about his situation and tried to understand why he was being exiled. "If I am really the king's son, I do not deserve this to happen to me. And if I am not the king's son, I also do not deserve to have to flee for no reason. What have I done wrong?" He felt that a terrible tragedy had happened to him, and he began to drink and visit brothels. He wanted to spend his life doing nothing else but getting drunk and following his heart's desires, since he had been exiled without reason. The new king took over the kingdom with a firm hand. Whenever he heard people speaking and spreading rumors of the exchange, he would punish them harshly. He ruled with strength and arrogance. Then, one day, the king went hunting with his royal ministers. They came to a pleasant area where a river was flowing and stopped there to rest and stroll about. The king lay down and began thinking about how he had exiled the other son for no reason. No matter what the truth was, it was not fair. If the other were actually the prince, then not only had he lost his position because of the exchange, but he had been exiled without reason. And if he was not the king's son, he also did not deserve to be exiled, since he had done nothing wrong. The king thought about it and regretted the great wrong that he had done. But he did not know what to do for himself or what advice to follow. He could not speak to anyone to get advice. Worrying about this, he became quite depressed. He told his ministers to go back. He had this concern, and he did not feel like being on an outing. The entire group returned home. When the king got back, he obviously had many other interests and concerns. He became involved with his affairs and soon forgot about the entire matter. Meanwhile, the king's true son continued his activities and squandered his money. One day he took a stroll by himself and then lay down to rest. He started thinking about what had happened to him. What has God done to me? He thought. If I am the king's son, then it is certainly not right. And if I am not the king's son, I still don't deserve to be an exiled fugitive. Then he began to look at the matter in a different light. On the contrary, if it is so, if God can do such a thing, to exchange a king's son, and all this should happen to him, is it right what I have done? Was it proper for me to act as I did? He began to grieve and regret very much the evil deeds that he had done. Afterwards, he returned home and began getting drunk again. But since he had already begun to have thoughts of regret and repentance, these thoughts constantly bothered him. One night, he went to sleep and dreamed that there was a fair in a certain place on a certain day. He was told to go there and take the first job he was offered, even if he felt that it was beneath his dignity. When he woke up, the dream was embedded firmly in his thoughts. Sometimes the thought is immediately forgotten, but this dream was constantly on his mind. However, he felt that it was something very difficult to do, so he just got all the more drunk. The dream, however, recurred a number of times, and it disturbed him very much. Once he was told in the dream, if you want to have any pity on yourself, do as you have been told. He then realized that he had to obey the dream. He went and gave all the rest of his money to his host. He also left all his fine clothing with his host, wearing only a simple merchant's robe. Thus he went to the fair. Merchant's robe, pinche in Yiddish. He arrived there and got up early to attend the fair. When he got there, he met a merchant who asked him, "Would you like a job?" "Yes," he replied. "I am driving some cattle," said the merchant. "You can work for me." Because of the dream, he did not take any time to think the matter over. He immediately said that he would. The merchant took him on, and immediately gave him work to do. He ordered him around as a master would order his servants. The young man began to appraise his situation. This type of work was certainly not befitting his situation. He was a gentleman, a delicate person, and now he had to drive animals, walking on foot alongside them. Still, he could not change his mind. The merchant was ordering him around like a master. The young man asked him, "How can I drive the animals all by myself?" "I have other drovers for my animals," replied the merchant. "You can work alongside them." With that, the merchant gave him some animals to drive, and he brought them outside of the city. There the other drovers were gathered, and they all set out together. The young man helped drive the animals, while the merchant rode alongside on his horse. The merchant rode the horse cruelly, with anger, and arrogance, and treated the young man even more cruelly. Seeing how cruel the merchant was, the young man was very frightened. He was afraid that the merchant would strike him with his staff. He was so gentle that such a blow would surely kill him. He thus drove the animals with the merchant alongside them. Finally they came to a place, and they took the sack of bread that the merchant had given the drivers to eat. They also gave the young man from this bread, and he ate it. Afterwards they passed close to a very thick forest, where trees were very close to each other. Two of the animals that the young man was driving for the merchant strayed away. The merchant screamed at him. So he followed them to catch them. They ran further away, while he ran after them. The forest was so dense and thick that as soon as he entered the forest they could not see each other. He immediately became hidden from his companions. The more he chased the animals, the farther they fled. He continued chasing them until he was deep in the forest. He thought over his situation. No matter what I do, I will die. If I go back without the animals, the merchant will kill me. He really thought that this was true. He was so afraid of the merchant that he was sure that he would be killed if he returned without the animals. But if I stay here, he thought, I will be killed by wild beasts in the forest. Why should I go back to the merchant? How can I confront him without the animals? He was deathly afraid of his employer. He continued chasing the animals, but the more he chased them, the more they fled. Meanwhile, it became night. He had never before spent the night deep in the forest like this. He heard wild animals growling and decided, I will climb a tree and spend the night there. All night he heard the sound of wild animals roaring. In the morning he looked and saw his cattle standing right next to him. He climbed down from the tree, but when he tried to catch them, they ran further away. The more he chased them, the more they ran. The animals then found some grass and began to graze, but when he tried to catch them, they ran away again. He kept on chasing them, and they kept on running away. He continued chasing them, and they continued fleeing, until they got deeper and deeper into the forest. They were so deep in the forest, and so far from civilization, that the wild beasts there were not afraid of man at all. Night fell again, and when he heard the beasts roaring, he was very much afraid. Then he saw an immense tree. He climbed the tree, and when he got up in the tree, he found another person lying there. He was very frightened. At the same time, however, he was somewhat comforted, since he had found another person there. They began questioning one another. Who are you? He asked. A human being. Who are you? A human being. How did you get here? The young man did not want to tell him what had happened, so he said, because of the cattle. I was tending cattle, and 2 animals strayed. This is how I got here. He then asked the stranger he found in the tree, how did you get here? I came here because of a horse, replied the other. I was out riding, and when I stopped to rest, Yiddish, to rest, lafush in Hebrew, which would mean to stretch, to rest. The horse strayed into the forest. I tried to catch it, but it fled further and further until I came here. They decided to join forces and remain together. They spoke about how they would remain together even after they got to civilization. The 2 of them spent the night in the tree. They heard the wild beasts roaring and making a great noise. In the morning, he heard the sound of loud laughter. Ha ha ha! Ha ha ha! Passing over the entire forest. The laughter seemed to spread all over the forest. It was such loud laughter that the sound made the tree tremble and shake. The young man was very confused and terrified by the sound. The stranger he had discovered in the tree said, I'm not afraid of this anymore. I spent a number of nights here already, and just before each day I hear the sound of laughter, making all the trees tremble and shake. The young man was still very upset, And he said to his companion, "This seems to be a place of the dark forces," the known ones in Hebrew, Shindaladim in Yiddish. "Such laughter is never heard in civilized areas. Who has ever heard laughter all over the world? Who has ever heard laughter all over the world? Or over all the world? All over the world or over all the world." It was then daybreak, and they saw their animals standing nearby. The young man's cattle were there alongside the stranger's horse. They climbed down and began to give chase, one after the cattle and the other after the horse. The cattle fled further away, and the young man ran after them as before. The stranger also ran after the horse, which ran further away. Eventually they were far from each other. Meanwhile, the young man found a bag of bread. "This is surely very precious in the wilderness." He took the sack on his shoulders and continued after the cattle. Suddenly he encountered another stranger. He was very frightened, but he was also comforted for having found another human being here. "How did you come here?" asked the stranger. He responded by asking the stranger, "How did you come here?" "I?" replied the stranger. "My father and my father's fathers grew up here. But you? How did you come here? No one from a civilized area ever comes here." The young man was very confused. He realized that the stranger was not a human being. He had said that no one from a civilized area ever comes here, and that his fathers had grown up here. He was obviously not a human being. Still, this stranger from the forest was behaving in a friendly manner and did nothing to harm him. "What are you doing here?" asked the forest man of the king's true son. He replied that he was chasing his animals. "Stop chasing your sins," said the stranger. "These are not animals at all. They are your sins, and they are leading you around. But it is now sufficient. You have already received your punishment. Now you can stop chasing. Come with me, and you will attain what is coming to you." The king's true son went with him, but he was afraid to speak to him and ask him any questions. He realized that the other was not a human being. Perhaps he would open his mouth and swallow him. While he was walking after the forest man, he encountered his companion who was chasing his horse. As soon as he saw him, he signaled him. "This stranger with me is not a human being. Don't talk to him. Don't have any dealings with him, since he is not human." His companion joined them. He then whispered in his companion's ear, "This stranger is not human," telling him everything he knew. His companion, the man with the horse, stared at him and saw the sack of bread on the shoulder. He began to plead, "My brother, I have not eaten for days. Give me bread." He replied, "Here in the desert, such pleas are of no avail. My life comes first. I need the bread for myself." The other began to plead and beg, "I will give you anything I have." The king's true son, however, realized that here in the wilderness, no gift or bribe is worth as much as bread. He replied, "What can you give me? Here in the wilderness, what can you trade for bread?" The man with the horse said to the man with the cattle, who was the king's true son, "I will give you my entire self. I will sell myself to you for bread." The man with the cattle decided to buy the stranger. He made up his mind that it would be a good bargain to buy a person for some bread. He bought the other as an eternal slave. The other made an oath and swore that he would be his eternal slave when they came to civilization. The king's son would give him bread, and they would eat together from the sack until the bread was used up. They followed the forest man. The man with the horse, who was now his slave, followed the man with the cattle, and the two of them walked behind the forest man. Things were now somewhat easier for the king's son. If he had to lift something or needed something else done, he would order his slave to do it for him. They followed the forest man until they came to a place of serpents and scorpions. The king's son was very much afraid. Out of fear, he asked the forest man, "How can we get across?" "You think that's hard?" replied the other. How can you get to my house? How can you get to my house? How can you get to my house?" With that, he pointed to his house. Which was standing in mid-air. "How can you get to my house?" he asked. They went with the forest man, and he brought them safely across, and then brought them into his house. He gave them food and drink, and then went on his way. The king's true son, who had been with the cattle, made use of the slave for all his needs. Meanwhile, the slave was very upset. He had sold himself as a slave because he needed bread. He had only needed that bread for 1 hour, since he had plenty of food to eat. For an hour's worth of food, he would now be a slave for the rest of his life. He moaned and sighed. How did I come to such a state, to be a slave? The king's true son, who was his master, asked him, "What great status did you have before, that you are groaning for having come to this state?" He answered, telling him the whole story of how he had been a king, and that people had spread rumors that he had been exchanged as an infant. The man with the horse was actually the king, who had been the son of the slave woman. He related how he had exiled his friend. Then, one time, he realized that it was an evil thing, and he had regretted it. After that, he constantly regretted the evil deed and the great wrong that he had done to his friend. Then, one night he had a dream that he could make up this wrong by abdicating his kingdom and going wherever his eyes would lead him. This would be an atonement for his sin. But he did not want to do it. However, the dreams continued to disturb him and urge that he do it, until he finally decided to. He abdicated his kingdom and wandered around until he came here. Now he had become a slave. The king's true son, who was with the man with the cattle, listened to everything that the man with the horse, who was now his slave, said, and he remained silent. He said to himself, "I will see what happens. Then I will make up my mind how to deal with him." That night, the forest man came and gave them food and drink. They spent the night there. Before morning, they heard the sound of the loud laughter, which made all the trees shake and tremble. The slave persuaded the king's true son, who was his master, to ask the forest man the meaning of this. The king's son asked the forest man, "What is this loud sound of laughter every day before morning?" He replied, "This is the sound of the day laughing at the night. The night asks the day, 'Why is it when you come, I do not have a name? I do not have a name.' Then the day laughs with this loud laughter, and then it becomes day. This is the significance of the sound of laughter." The king's son found this very astonishing. It is a very wondrous thing that the day laughs at the night. In the morning, the forest man once again went on his way, while they remained there eating and drinking. At night he came back, and they ate, drank, and spent the night. That night they heard the sounds of the beasts. All of them were making noise and roaring with different sounds. The lion roared, while the leopard growled with a different sound, and the birds chirped and whistled with their own sounds. All of them made loud sounds, and at first they trembled in fear. They were so afraid that they could not concentrate on the sounds. However, they then began to concentrate, and they heard that it was the sound of music, an awesomely beautiful song. They listened more intently and heard that it was a very wondrous chant. It was a tremendous joy to hear. All the joys in the world were like nothing, like absolute nothingness compared to the wondrous enjoyment of listening to this song. They discussed the situation and agreed that they would remain there forever. They had enough to eat and drink, and they could enjoy this wonderful delight, compared to which all other enjoyments were nothing. The slave persuaded his master, the king's true son, to ask the forest man the meaning of this song, and he asked. The forest man replied that the sun had made a garment for the moon. The animals of the forest realized that the moon does them a great service. Animals dominate the night, because sometimes they must enter an inhabited area. They cannot do this by day, so their main time is the night. By shining for them, then, the moon provides for them a great benefit. The wild animals therefore agreed that they would compose a new melody in honor of the moon. This is the melody that they were now hearing. All the animals and birds are singing a new song in honor of the moon's receiving a garment from the sun. When they heard that this was a melody, they paid even more attention to it. They heard that it was a very wonderful and beautiful song. The forest man said to them, "Why do you find this so novel? I have an instrument that I received from my ancestors, a kli in Hebrew, that I received from my ancestors, who in turn inherited it from their fathers' fathers. The instrument is made with special leaves and colors. When this instrument is placed on any animal or bird, the creature immediately begins to sing this song. The laughter was then heard, and it was day. The forest man went on his way, and the king's true son went to search for the instrument. He searched the entire room, but could not find it, and he was afraid to go any further. The area. The king's true son and his slave were afraid to ask the forest man to bring them back to civilization. The forest man then returned and told them that he would bring them back to civilization. When he had brought them to a civilized area, he gave the instrument to the king's true son and said, "I am giving you this instrument." Then referring to the slave son, who had become king and was now a slave again, he said, "You will know how to deal with him." "Where shall we go?" they asked. The forest man told them that they should ask around and seek a land known as the foolish land with the wise king. The narische land in der Kliege Malchus. In which direction shall we begin asking about this land? They asked. The forest man pointed out the direction and said to the king's true son, "Go to the king there, and you will attain your greatness." They set out and began their journey. They wanted very much to find a wild or domestic animal so as to try out the instrument, to see if it would produce the wondrous song. But they did not encounter any animals. Then, when they had come closer to an inhabited area, they came across an animal. They placed the instrument on it, and it began to sing the song of the forest. They continued traveling until they came to the land the forest man had described. There was a wall all around the land, with no means of getting in except through one gate. They had to walk several miles until they came to the gate where they could enter the land. They walked around along the wall until they finally came to the gate. When they came to the gate, the guards did not want to let them come in, since the king of the land had died, and his son was now the new king. The king had left a will declaring that although the land had previously been called the foolish land with the wise king, after his death it would be called the wise land with the foolish king. The wise land with the foolish king. If a man came and was successful in restoring the land's name to the foolish land with the wise king, that man would be king. No one was being allowed to enter the land unless he was prepared to undertake this. They therefore did not want the king's son to enter. They said to him, "Can you undertake the task of restoring the land's original name?" It was certainly impossible for him to attempt it. They therefore could not go in. The slave urged the king's son to return home, but he did not want to, since the forest man had told him to go to this land, and here he would come to his greatness. Just then another man arrived. He was riding a horse, and he wanted to enter the gate. However, the guards would not let him in for the same reason as before. Seeing the stranger's horse standing there, he placed the instrument on it. It began to play the wonderful melody of the forest. The horse's owner asked very strongly that he sell him this instrument, but he refused to sell it. "What can you give me for such a wonderful instrument?" asked the king's son. The horse's owner said, "What can you really do with this instrument? It has no real use. At best, you can make a show and get a gulden, in Yiddish dinner, in Yiddish a gulden, in Yiddish a dinner, in Hebrew a dinner. I have knowledge that is better than your instrument. from my father's father, I have inherited the knowledge of how to understand one thing from another thing. What I have from my father's fathers is the knowledge of how to understand one thing from another thing. No matter what someone says, through the tradition that I have, I can understand one thing from another. I have never revealed this to anyone in the world, but if you give me your instruments, I will teach you this knowledge. The king's son, who had this instrument, decided that it would be very wonderful to understand one thing from another. He gave the horse's owner the instruments, and the other taught him the method through which he could understand one thing from another. Now that the king's true son could understand one thing from another, when he went to the land's gate, he understood that it would be possible for him to make an effort to restore the land's original name. Since he understood one thing from another, he understood that it would be possible, even though he did not know how, or by what means. Nevertheless, understanding one thing from another, he understood that it would be possible. He therefore made up his mind that he would tell them to let him enter, since he would make an effort to restore the land's original name. After all, what could he lose? He spoke to the men who would not let anyone enter without making the effort, and told them to let him in. He would make the effort to restore the land's original name. They let him enter and informed the ruling ministers that a man had been found who was willing to make an effort to restore the land's original name. He was brought to the ministers of the land, and they told him, "You must realize that we are not fools. Heaven forbid, however. The late king was so extraordinarily wise that compared to him, we were all considered fools. It was for this reason that the land was called the foolish land with the wise king. When the king died, his son took his place. He is also wise, but compared to us, he is not wise at all. The land is therefore now called the opposite, the wise land with the foolish king." The king left the will stating that when a wise person was found who could restore the original name to the kingdom, that person would be king. He ordered his son that when such a person was found, the son should abdicate the throne, and let the wise person be king. This person would have to be so extraordinarily wise that compared to him, everyone else would be foolish. This man would be king, and then the name of the land would once again be the foolish land with the wise king, since compared to him, everyone else would be fools. Now, you know what you are getting yourself into. The ministers continued, "We have a test to see if you are so wise. There is a garden here which was left by the late king, who was an extremely wise man. This garden is a great wonder. All sorts of metal instruments grow in it, gold instruments and silver instruments. It is an awesome wonder. However, it is impossible to enter the garden. As soon as anyone enters it, he is pursued, and he begins to scream. He does not know who is chasing him, and he sees nothing still. He is pursued until he is chased out of the garden. Let us see if you are wise enough to enter this garden." The king's son asked them if the person who enters the garden is beaten in any way. They answered, "Primarily he is chased, and he does not know who is chasing him, but he flees in great terror." This is what they had been told by people who had entered the garden. The king's true son went to the garden. He saw that there was a wall around it and an open gate. There were no guards there, since such a garden obviously did not need guards. He went up to the garden and looked. Next to the garden, he saw a statue of a man. He looked more closely and saw a tablet above the man. The inscription on it said that this man had been a king many centuries ago, and during this king's reign there had been peace. Before this king's reign there had been wars, and afterward there had also been wars, but during his reign there had been peace. He contemplated the situation. He already could understand one thing from another, and understood that everything depended on this man. When a person entered the garden and was pursued, he did not have to run out at all. He only had to stand next to this man, and he would be saved. Furthermore, if this man were stood in the middle of the garden instead of next to it, then anyone would be able to enter the garden safely. The king's son understood all this, since he was able to understand one thing from another. The king's son went and entered the garden. As soon as he was pursued, he walked over and stood next to this man, who stood just outside the garden. He was thus able to leave safely without being harmed. Literally left in peace, without being harmed. Others who had entered the garden had fled in such terror when they were pursued that they had been injured. However, the king's son had emerged safely and calmly, since he had stood next to the statue. The ministers were amazed to see him come out safely. The king's true son then ordered that the statue be placed in the middle of the garden. When this was done, all the ministers were able to enter the garden. They entered the garden and went out in peace, without being harmed in any way. The minister said, "Nevertheless, even though we have seen such a thing from you, nevertheless, for one thing you do not deserve to get you the kingdom. Nevertheless, for one thing you do not deserve to get you the kingdom. We shall give you one more test." They explained, the late king had a throne. This throne is very tall, and next to it stand all kinds of animals and birds. And next to it stand all kinds of animals and birds carved out of wood. In front of the throne stands a bed. There is a table near the bed, and on the table stands a lamp. From the throne, well-trodden, walled paths go forth. Well-trodden, walled paths go forth. Well-trodden, walled paths go forth. These paths go forth from all sides of the throne, but no one knows the relationship of the throne to these paths. After the paths spread out for a certain distance, there is a golden lion standing by the first one. If a person comes near to it, it opens its mouth to swallow him. However, the path extends far beyond the lion. The same is true of the other paths extending from the throne. Thus, the second path extending from the throne is very much the same. Standing there is another type of wild beast, such as a leopard, made of a different metal. It is also impossible to come close to it. The path then extends beyond where it is standing. This is true of all the paths. These paths extend throughout the entire land. No one understands the meaning of the throne with all its details in the paths. This then will be your test. See if you can understand the significance of the throne and everything associated with it. They showed him the throne, and he saw that it was extremely tall. He went over to the throne and gazed at it. As he contemplated the throne, he realized that it was made of the same type of wood as the box or instrument that the forest man had given him. He gazed further and saw that a rose was missing from the top of the throne. If the rose were in the throne, then the throne would have the same power as the box, which would produce music whenever it was placed on any animal or bird. Then he gazed even more and noticed that the rose missing from the top of the throne was lying at the bottom of the throne. He would have to take it and place it on top, and then the throne would have the same power as the box. The late king had devised each detail with such wisdom that no person could understand its significance until an extraordinarily wise person came along who would understand the concept. He would then know how to exchange and arrange all things correctly. He then saw that the same was true of the bed. He understood that it had to be moved slightly from the place where it stood. The table also had to be moved somewhat, and the lamp likewise had to have its position adjusted. The birds and animals also had to be moved to different places. Thus a bird would have to be taken from one place and set in another place. The same was true of all the animals. The king had cleverly disguised everything so that only a very wise person would be able to contemplate it and then rearrange it correctly. The same was true of the line which stood where the path emerged. It had to be stood in a different place. This was true of all the beasts on the paths. The king's son gave instructions that everything be rearranged properly to take the rows from the bottom and inserted on top. Everything else was also rearranged in proper order. The king's son gave instructions that everything be rearranged properly to take the rows from the bottom and inserted on top. Everything else was also rearranged in proper order. All the animals and birds then began to sing a very wonderful melody. Each one functioned properly. The king's son was then given the kingdom. The king's son, who had by now been crowned king, then said to the actual son of the slave woman, "Now I understand that I am actually the king's son, and you are actually the slave woman's son. Now I understand that I am actually the king's son, and you are actually the slave woman's son." After telling the story, the Rebbe, may his light shine, said the following. In earlier generations, when Kabbalah was discussed, it was discussed in the manner of this story. Since until the time of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Kabbalah was not discussed openly. Only Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai revealed Kabbalah explicitly. Earlier, when the initiates discussed Kabbalah, they would use veiled expressions. When they placed the ark on the cattle, they began to sing. Understand this. This involves the renewal of the moon, which exists when the moon receives new concepts from the sun. Thus, when the ark was carried to the house of the sun, Beis Shemesh, all the animals, chayos, which carry the throne, began to make a new melody. This is the concept of a psalm. Sing to God a new song. This is the song that the cattle of Bashan sang. This is also the idea of the bed, table, throne, and lamp. They are the rectification of the divine presence. This is also the concept of the garden. Adam was exiled from the garden, but the Shabbos protected him, as discussed in the sacred literature. The Shabbos is the concept of the king who has peace. This relates to the king who had peace in his days. Therefore, the king's son stood next to the Shabbos. Further, he did not explain. After telling the story, the Rebbe also said these words. This story is a great wonder. It is all one. The animals, the throne, and the garden are all one. Sometimes, a concept alluded to in the story is given one name, and sometimes another, according to the context of the concept. These ideas are a very deep, awesome wonder. The Rebbe then said, there is also much more, but it is not necessary to reveal it to you. The king in the above-mentioned land had done something representing the sun and something representing the moon. That is, the things he did alluded to the sun and the moon. The moon held a lamp in its hand, but when day came, the lamp could not shine, since of what avail is a lamp in broad daylight? This is the significance of what the night said to the day. Why is it that when you arrive, I do not have a name? During the day, the lamp is of no avail. The explanation of the story is like the throne the king made. The main knowledge lies in understanding how to arrange each thing. So too, one who knows the sacred texts and has an unblemished heart, then one will be able to understand the explanation. However, one must know how to arrange the components well, since sometimes they are given one name and sometimes another. The same is true of the other aspects of the story. Sometimes a character in the story is given one name and sometimes another. This is true of all the story's components. Happy is he who is worthy of understanding these concepts correctly. Blessed be God forever. Amen and Amen. All these are the words of our holy Rebbe. May he rest in peace. May the memory of a tzaddik be a blessing. Nanach nachman meyoman, nanach nachman meyoman.